Okay, so you want to own a commercial honeybee operation. You've seen the jars lining a farmer's market table, $12 each, golden and glowing in the sunlight, and you've watched people line up to buy them without even asking the price. You do the math in your head. One healthy hive can produce 60 to 90 pounds of honey a year, and if you scale that across 100 hives, that's thousands of jars a season, practically free money, once the bees are doing all the actual work. You think, this has to be one of the most peaceful, low-overhead businesses out there. No rent, no storefront, just boxes in a field and nature doing the heavy lifting. That is the picture in your head right now. And I need you to hold on to it for one more minute, because the real financial story behind commercial beekeeping is far more fragile than a jar on a farmer's market table. And almost nobody tells you that the honey itself is often the smallest and least reliable part of how this business actually survives. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why so many beekeeping operations that look thriving in July can be financially wiped out by the following spring, and why the operators who actually make real money from bees barely think about honey at all. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button, because this channel breaks down the real economics behind the businesses everyone assumes are simple, and this one is stranger than almost anything we've covered. Let's start with what it actually costs to get a real operation running, because this is the first place the fantasy and the reality collide. A single fully equipped hive, meaning the wooden boxes called supers, the frames inside them, a queen, and a starter colony of bees, typically costs between $200 and $400 to establish from scratch. A commercial operation, the kind actually capable of generating meaningful income rather than a hobby producing a few jars for friends, generally starts at a minimum of 100 to 200 hives, meaning your initial equipment and colony investment alone can run $20,000 to $80,000 before you've harvested a single ounce of honey. Then comes the extraction equipment, because you cannot simply squeeze honey out of a frame by hand at any meaningful scale, and a proper extraction setup, the centrifuge that spins honey out of the comb, an uncapping station, settling tanks and bottling equipment, typically runs $15,000 to $50,000, depending on how automated you want the process to be. Add a dedicated truck or trailer capable of hauling dozens of hives at once, since, as we're about to get into, commercial bees rarely stay in one place, and a suitable flatbed setup runs another $25,000 to $60,000. All in, a genuinely commercial-scale operation with a few hundred hives, extraction equipment, and transportation typically requires an upfront investment somewhere between $80,000 and $250,000, a number that surprises almost everyone who assumed this business started with little more than a few wooden boxes and a bee suit. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the equipment cost is honestly the easy part to understand. A number you pay once and move past. The real financial commitment of running a commercial bee operation is a recurring, relentless set of costs and risks that exist whether your hives are thriving or quietly collapsing, and this is exactly where the peaceful honey farm fantasy starts to fall apart. Winter feeding is the first major recurring cost almost nobody outside the industry knows exists, because bees need enough stored honey and supplemental sugar syrup to survive the cold months when no flowers are blooming, and commercial beekeepers typically spend $15 to $30 per hive annually just on supplemental feed to prevent starvation, a cost that scales directly with your hive count and arrives every single year regardless of how good your honey harvest was that summer. Then there's queen replacement, because a hive's productivity depends entirely on having a healthy, actively laying queen, and queens naturally decline or die roughly every 1 to 2 years, meaning a commercial operation needs to budget $30 to $50 per replacement queen across a meaningful percentage of the entire operation annually, simply to keep colonies productive rather than slowly declining toward collapse. Add mite treatment, because the varroa mite, a parasite that has devastated bee populations across North America for decades, requires ongoing chemical or organic treatment multiple times a year just to keep a colony alive, typically running another $10 to $20 per hive annually. and the recurring, unglamorous cost of simply keeping bees alive before they've produced a single drop of sellable honey starts looking a lot less like passive income and a lot more like livestock ranching with wings. If you've subscribed already, thank you, and if you haven't yet, this is genuinely the moment, because what comes next is the part that decides whether a bee operation survives past its first few years or quietly collapses along with its hives. Let's talk about colony collapse, because this is the single biggest hidden risk in this entire industry, and it's almost never priced in honestly before someone commits real money to hundreds of hives. Picture this. You've built up your operation over 3 seasons, 200 hives, a solid honey harvest each summer, everything running exactly like you'd hoped. Then one spring you open up your hives after winter and find entire colonies simply gone, no dead bees piled up, no obvious disease, just empty boxes where a thriving colony used to be, a phenomenon beekeepers call colony collapse disorder. And commercial beekeeping operations across the country have reported average annual colony losses running anywhere from 30 to 40% in difficult years, sometimes climbing even higher depending on regional pest pressure, pesticide exposure, and weather severity. Losing 40% of 200 hives in a single winter means losing the equivalent of 80 fully established colonies, each one representing months of feeding, treatment, and labor investment. And replacing that many colonies in a single season, either by purchasing new bees outright or dedicating existing healthy hives to slowly splitting and rebuilding, can cost tens of thousands of dollars and set an entire year's production back significantly. This is exactly why experienced commercial beekeepers never budget assuming every hive will survive winter, instead building an expected annual loss rate directly into their financial planning from day one. Because the operator who assumes their bees will simply be fine every single year is the same operator who gets financially blindsided the first time nature proves otherwise. This connects to something almost nobody explains to first-time operators before they scale up. Honey sales alone almost never cover the true cost of running a commercial operation at this scale, which is exactly why the real money in commercial beekeeping comes from an entirely different source most people never think about: pollination contracts. Large-scale farms growing almonds, blueberries, and other crops that depend on bee pollination pay beekeepers directly to truck their hives in during bloom season, and California's almond industry alone, the single largest managed pollination event on the planet, pays beekeepers somewhere between $150 and $200 per hive just for a few weeks of pollination work. Meaning an operator trucking in 1,000 hives for almond season can generate $150,000 to $200,000 in pollination income alone, often exceeding what that same operator could ever make selling honey from those same hives across an entire year. This is exactly why serious commercial beekeepers spend a huge portion of the year on the road, trucking hives across state lines, chasing bloom seasons, from almonds in California to blueberries in Maine, treating honey production almost as a secondary byproduct of a business that's actually built around a traveling pollination service. Quick reminder, if this is helping you see the numbers more clearly, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep making these breakdowns, and there's a lot more coming on exactly this kind of decision. Now let's put the entire picture together, because this is where the peaceful honey farm dream and the actual financial reality either line up or they don't. Take a mid-sized commercial operation, running 200 hives, generating honey revenue of roughly $40,000 a year at a realistic average yield and market price, alongside pollination contract income of around $30,000 from a single almond season trucking run, bringing total annual revenue to roughly $70,000. Against that, winter feeding and mite treatment combined run around $6,000 annually. Queen replacement across a portion of the hives adds another $3,000. Transportation costs for hauling hives to pollination contracts, including fuel and vehicle maintenance on specialized equipment, run another $12,000 a year. Extraction, bottling, and packaging supplies for the honey harvest add another $5,000. And budgeting realistically for annual colony losses, meaning the cost of replacing roughly a third of your hives every single year just to maintain your operation at the same size, adds another $15,000 to $20,000, easily the single largest and most unpredictable expense on the entire list. Add it all together, and total annual expenses land somewhere around $40,000 to $45,000, meaning that $70,000 revenue year, which sounds genuinely solid on paper, nets the operator somewhere around $25,000 to $30,000 before accounting for their own labor across an entire year of driving, lifting, and managing colonies. A number that looks a lot less like passive honey money and a lot more like a modest full-time wage for genuinely demanding physical work. Here's the part that never shows up in the farmer's market photo, and it's worth saying plainly before we close this out. The beekeepers who actually build real sustainable businesses in this industry almost never do it by chasing bigger honey harvests alone. They do it by treating pollination contracts as the true backbone of their revenue and honey as a valuable but secondary product layered on top. They do it by budgeting for colony loss the same way a rancher budgets for livestock mortality, as an expected recurring cost rather than a shocking exception. And they do it by understanding, before they ever bought their first 100 hives, that the peaceful image of bees quietly making honey in a sunny field was never quite the whole business. The real operation was always a traveling agricultural service, built on the backs of insects that can vanish overnight without warning. And the operators who respected that fragility from the very beginning are the ones still doing this a decade later. If this video helped you see what's actually happening behind that jar of honey at the farmer's market, do yourself a favor and subscribe, because we break down the real numbers behind the businesses people assume are simple, and this is exactly the kind of thing nobody tells you before you buy your first 100 hives.